Hello, this is Mr. Slattery. This is my presentation on reproductive strategies. This was the last chapter in Outcome 1 of Unit 2 for the VCE Biology Year 11 course. This particular subject will be looking at the different means by which two individuals will come together to raise offspring. We'll be looking at whether or not we have just two individuals or whether we have whole families, and whether or not there is any looking after the offspring once they've been born. The first and most familiar to most of us humans would be monogamy. This is the system by which one male and one female come together to raise the offspring. They may stay together for life, or they may only stay together for one breeding season. In the case of the albatross in the top picture, they tend to stay together for an entire season to raise the offspring, but will actually pair up again, the same pairs again, for the next season as well. But in between the breeding seasons, they go their separate ways. This particular means of raising young is very useful when the young are very demanding, or it takes a great deal of energy to get them to adult size, or at least a size at which they are independent. The albatross at the top picture, it takes two of them to feed the offspring during the breeding season for it to be able to grow fast enough. If it was only one parent feeding the offspring, it wouldn't be able to grow quick enough to fledge and be able to fly off before the weather deteriorates and there's no longer suitable conditions or enough food in the area to feed the baby. The amusing picture in the bottom is relates to humans. Humans, our offspring tend to require many years of raising before they are independent. You wouldn't really expect a 4 or 5 year old child to be able to go out into the world and make their way. They need to be in their teens at least. Because of this, it requires a long-term effort by both parents, preferably, to be able to raise the offspring. In contrast to monogamy, we now have polyandry. Poly means many, and andry comes from the Greek word andros, which means males. So in this system, we have many males mating with one female. This can have interesting side effects, because if we have more than one male mating with a female, you never know who the father is. And logically, the strongest male, and at least the strongest sperm, will father the offspring. It can also be useful in systems where there is a shortage of resources in that area, and the female will form a group at the center of all of the males, and the males will all help her to provide food for the offspring, because none of those males know whether or not that offspring is theirs, so they err on the side of caution and provide food for it as much as possible. High genetic diversity is another possibility. Again, it's because you don't know which of the males is the father, and it could be any one of them. Polyandry is also seen in humans. The picture at the bottom is of a queen who married 5 men, but it's more likely to happen in societies where, as I mentioned before, there is scarce resources, and it may take 5 men working a farm to be able to produce enough food to raise, to be able to raise children and feed themselves, the wife, and the children. Polygyny is a little bit more familiar to us. It's seen a lot in many animal species. Poly meaning many again, and gyne this time meaning referring to women. So this is a system where we have one male and many females. The male in this case needs to be particularly good at either providing for those multiple wives and probably multiple children. Either he has to be able to provide for them, or he has to be able to defend a territory. In the case of the gorillas down at the bottom, the male is defending the territory, and he also needs to defend the group from predators. So he's going to be particularly large and particularly powerful. In this case, unlike polyandry, the male in this circumstance can be certain that he is going to be the father, provided, of course, he is the only male that's actually doing any mating. It is possible for subordinate males to gain access to females when he's not looking. Alright, the system where we would see really a mixture of polyandry and almost polygyny at the same time within a group would be promiscuous sex. I can see I've got my heading at the top there wrong. It should be promiscuous with an extra S on the end. In this case, you will tend to see it in groups of animals where sex and the creation of bonds between individuals has great social significance. It can be used to bond the group together. You would also see it in groups where there is a variable resource supply, and the promiscuous sex means that whenever resources are available, the females will be pregnant as soon as possible because they will have mated many times with many males. They wouldn't have had to have necessarily waited for one male to get them pregnant. If we look back to, or think back to the last slide where we had the gorillas, and in this case, we at the top picture we have bonobos, and bonobos are a dwarf chimpanzee. Bonobos, for primates, have the largest genitals of all of the primates, and the gorillas in the previous picture have the smallest in proportion to their bodies. The gorillas don't need to have very large genitals because he doesn't use sex as a social bond. He also doesn't have to worry about being the father or not being the father of the offspring. With the bonobos, on the other hand, the larger genitals is a way of both attracting females and being more certain that you are the father of the offspring. This is because bonobos will produce much larger quantities of sperm, and those larger quantities will either flush out or overwhelm the sperm from previous males that female will have mated with. Now that the mating has occurred, we need to consider what sort of breeding this is actually putting into effect. Now, we see two terms here. Let's highlight them. We have the R selection and we have the K selection. These two refer to really how fast the breeding is. In R selection, the species will be producing many offspring, and they will tend to not invest as much time, effort and energy into the production or the raising of those offspring. My example at the top is the fly, which can produce hundreds and hundreds of maggots at a time. It basically lays them in a place where it finds food and then moves on. The other example I have in the bottom is the elephant, and the elephant will gestate its baby for about 22 months, so it's growing inside its mother for a very long time before it's born, and that is a tremendous investment in that single offspring by that mother elephant. So really what we're considering here is whether you produce very large quantities of offspring and really allow for the fact that you're going to lose probably 99% of them, against the elephant, which will try very hard not to lose any offspring whatsoever. So really it comes down to what extent the parents will go to ensure the survival of each individual offspring that they produce. Next thing we're going to look at is how the offspring are actually produced in the first place. The first system we will consider is oviparous. Oviparous literally means egg bearing. Ovi means egg, parous means bearing. Egg bearing species will tend to produce eggs which inside the mother's body. They then lay the eggs, and the eggs then develop outside of their mother's body. It's seen very commonly in fish, birds, reptiles, and a very few mammals. The mammals in question are called monotremes, as I've got here. Now, monotremes, there's really only two monotremes, and that is the platypus and the echidna. They're both very ancient forms of mammals, and are obviously both Australian species. Now, the amount of parental care that is then given after the egg is born will vary enormously. Some oviparous species will literally just lay the eggs and then go, much like sea turtles, who will lay them in a hole in the sand and then swim off. The other extreme would be something like the albatross that we saw earlier on, which will only produce one egg or two eggs at the most, and they will then put in a great deal of effort to raise that offspring once it's born. The picture at the bottom left, by the way, is a shark egg, and we will come back to sharks in just a couple of minutes. The other extreme from the oviparous is viviparous. Vivi means live and parous means bearing, so these are live young. Live young, the most common form for us to imagine would be ourselves. Mammals are generally live bearing, apart from the monotremes which we saw in the previous slide. Now, viviparous young, because they grow inside their mother's body, they have no means of gaining nutrients or oxygen through, say, an egg yolk or being outside. So they need to obtain all of their nutrients and oxygen from their mother. With placental mammals, as opposed to non-placental mammals, the way that is done is through the placenta and the umbilical cord. The placenta here is it's commonly referred to as being a plate of tissue which is adhered to the inside of the mother's womb. And what this does, it creates a very large surface area to volume ratio, where nutrients can pass from the mother's bloodstream into the baby's bloodstream. And it is absolutely vital, and we'll come back to this again in year 12, it's absolutely vital that the mother's and the baby's blood do not mix. If they do, then the mother will produce a massive immune response, and potentially life-threatening for both mother and baby. Non-placental mammals would be things like, let's just circle that, there we go. Non-placental mammals would be things like the picture at the bottom, which is a kangaroo. Now, marsupials tend to give birth to the young when it's still very, very small. It's generally about the size of a jelly bean. And the young then crawls up its mother's stomach and down into the pouch and fixes itself to a nipple. We can see we have the nipple here at the top, and then we have the baby at the bottom suckling on it. So really from then on, it obtains all of its nutrients from the mother through its milk. Now, viviparous young tend to have more parental care on average than oviparous, because they've had to grow inside the mother's body. But once they're born, there's no guarantee that you will then see a great deal of parental care. Now, a strange combination of both oviparous and viviparous is something that you would see in many species of sharks and some species of snakes, and this is a system called ovoviviparous. And ovoviviparous is where eggs are produced but they're not actually laid, they're retained within the mother's body. This is presumably to keep them safe, and to enable them as much as possible to be born at a larger size where they are going to be a little bit more independent. With sharks, the species that we see in the picture here is a great white, but there's a close species, close relative of the great white called the porbeagle, and porbeagle young hatch inside the mother's body, and they're not born straight away. There will be several young inside the mother's uterus, and they will then compete with each other. The mother's uterus lining will secrete a certain amount of nutrient, but there can also be a certain amount of cannibalism inside the mother, so the young will actually compete, and one of them will eventually end up eating the others and be the only one that ends up getting born alive, at least. The snake down at the bottom here looks like a very large python species, and this one is giving birth to a large quantity of young. These young would have been growing inside their mother, and they would have been feeding off of yolk, which would have been attached to them, almost like a placenta. They would not have been competing with each other, and all of them would probably be born quite happy and healthy. Alright, we will now quickly consider reproductive strategies in plants. We see three terms at the top here: gymnosperms, pteridophytes and angiosperms. These are the three very large groups of plants. Gymnosperms are conifers, and they tend to produce pollen, just like you would see in flowering plants, but their pollen doesn't tend to get transferred to other conifers by insects. They're almost all wind pollinated, so they produce very, very large quantities of pollen, which then blows on the breeze and hopefully lands on the right part of another tree so that it can then form seeds. The next word down is pteridophytes. Now, pteridophytes are a group of very old plants, and they include the ferns and another group called the liverworts. Now, pteridophytes are interesting because they have what's called a sexual stage, and they have a non-sexual stage. And in the sexual stage, they will produce sperm, and those sperm will then fertilize the eggs, and those eggs will then grow into new plants. The underside of this fern leaf that we see here contains, let's zoom in here and see what we can see. If we zoom right in, we can see that we have basically large clusters of spores. Spores are very much like seeds in this case, and they will be ready to be released, and they can float off on the breeze and start new plants. The third word on our list is angiosperms. Angiosperms are flowering plants. Those are the ones that we see all around us. Everything from carrots to eucalyptus are classified as angiosperms. That also, by the way, includes grasses. Now, angiosperms formed a relationship with insects tens of millions of years ago, which means that they will use insects to transfer pollen from one plant to another. This isn't necessarily used by all angiosperms, though. Many of them, many species of grasses in particular, will still use wind pollination, but most of the broadleaf plants that we would see are very often insect pollinated. If we zoom in, we can see on the picture at the top here, this is a eucalyptus flower, and what the eucalyptus flower has done is it has a whirl of red filaments coming out from the middle. Those red filaments have little white dots at the ends, and those little white dots are the anthers, and the anthers contain the pollen. What the eucalyptus flower needs the insects to do is to take the pollen from one flower, and there's little white dots there, you see, and it needs to transfer it to this little green dot at the very end of a little spike there, but preferably on another flower. It doesn't particularly want to pollinate itself, but it gets the insect to go from one flower to another by paying it. And it pays it with, let's get a different colour here, it pays it with sugar water. And the sugar water is found at the base of that spike. And that means that the insect has to walk across all of the pollen to get to the sugar water. As it's doing that, it's then going to be transferring pollen that it's picked up from other flowers to the stigma on this one, and thus pollinating it. Okay, if we zoom out, we can now have a look at a couple more rather more specialist structures. This one down in the bottom right hand corner, this is an orchid. It's an Angræcum species, and at the back of the flower there is a long, what's called a spur, hanging down, and at the end of that spur, on the inside, because it's hollow, on the end of that spur we have a nectary. So the sugar water is at the end of a very long tube. This requires a very specific pollinator. Not just any insect can pollinate this, and this particular one is pollinated by a hawk moth, which has a very long tongue. In this case, the tongue's around about a foot long, 30 centimetres. This particular species is known as the Darwin's orchid because Charles Darwin studied this particular flower and predicted that a moth species with a very long tongue would be found, and that would be the one that was the pollinator. But nobody believed him because it would be an extremely big moth with an extremely big tongue. And it wasn't till many years after he died that this particular species was found. Our next example on this slide is what's called a hammer orchid, and this particular orchid has a structure that mimics a female wasp. She's there to attract a male, and if I just get my let's have a blue one, shall we? When the male moth the male wasp, comes along, he will land on the back here, and he will try and then fly off with the female. This particular species mates on the wing. So he's going to come along and he's going to try and fly off with her and mate as they're flying along. But as he tries to grab her and fly off, this whole thing hinges right here in the middle. And that causes the male and the fake female to come over and slam into this little structure, the green structure that sticks up here. And what that structure contains is the pollen. Now, for many orchids, the pollen comes off as one big lump. It's called pollinia, so it's you transfer really all of the pollen from that one flower at once. This doesn't hurt the male wasp in any way. He probably just finds it a little bit confusing and inconvenient. He then flies off, carrying the pollinia on his back. And if I could draw the pollinia there, it tends to come as a little teardrop-shaped thing like that. He will then fly off with that pollinia to another flower and do the whole process all over again, because when males are in breeding mode, they're not very quick learners. This then transfers the pollen to the next flower. Once the flower has been pollinated, the plant then produces seeds. Now, we get two main sorts of seeds from two large groups of angiosperm plants. That's the flowering plants. Now, I've got a picture of each on the slide here. The first one that we're going to look at is the one in the center, and this one has two large seed leaves, as they're called, 1 and 2. The picture on the right hand side doesn't appear to contain any of these seed leaves at all, but it does actually contain one, and it's just that very fine sliver that you can see there. It's mostly wrapped around the stalk of the next leaf that's coming up. Now, these seed leaves are called cotyledons. Let's see if we can write this. Cotyledon. Now, plants that produce two of them are called dicotyledonous, and plants that only produce one are called monocotyledonous. Now, dicotyledonous plants are really the vast majority of the plants that we tend to see around us. Monocotyledonous plants are basically grasses and palms. But I digress. What I really need to look at here is the endosperm within the leaves. Now, endosperm is, endo means internal, and sperm refers to the structure. Now, endosperm is, for most seeds, is a food supply within the seed that enables it to get growing, or at least develop its seed leaves properly before it can start photosynthesizing and produce its own food. What this means to the plant species that produces that seed is that the endosperm is an investment in each individual seed by the mother plant that produced it. And that food and energy store has to come from somewhere, and it's come from the mother. So the more endosperm that a seed has, the better its chances of growing large enough to start photosynthesizing, and the more energy that the mother has to put into it. A contrast to this is the picture down in the bottom left-hand corner, and these seeds are absolutely tiny. These are this is pictured under a microscope, and the seeds themselves are really just these little dark spots here, and they are a very immature embryo. There's no endosperm whatsoever on these. The benefit to doing this is that these very tiny seeds are very, very light, and they can be dispersed on the wind very easily, whereas a very large heavy plant seed, if you consider something like an acorn, is quite large and heavy, and it's going to drop from the mother plant, and unless something picks it up and eats it and walks off with it, it's not going to travel very far away. So the plant has to come up with a compromise between the amount of energy that it puts into each seed to enable it to survive, or giving it the opportunity to spread far away from the mother plant so that it is not in competition. The picture down in the bottom left-hand corner, by the way, is an orchid, would you believe? This brings us to the end of this screencast on reproductive strategies, and I will be continuing the course material with further screencasts as and when I can make them. Thanks for listening.